I have a confession to make, and given my penchant for historical phonology, this truly is a guilty pleasure. I really like the sound of ecclesiastical Latin. Gasp, I hear you say. You, Luke Amadeus Ranieri? Is this the same man who has hundreds of videos in restored classical Latin pronunciation on the YouTube channel Scorpio Martianus, shameless plug, with the express purpose of teaching and promoting the sound of classical Latin? Surely this is not the same man, you cry, who lashed out at those who would dare to pronounce ancient Greek in an ahistorical manner. And when I hear things that are just very strange anachronisms, it bothers me, and this drives me insane. Impossible! But it is possible, my friends. But why? Why should I like it at all, rather than feel mere indifference towards it? The traditional scholastic Italian pronunciation of Latin, which since the early 20th century has been adopted as the Catholic Ecclesiastical Pronunciation of Latin, has its origins in the circa 800 AD Carolingian Latin language reforms by Alcuin, who instituted one sound for each letter, effectively restoring the classical pronunciation almost exactly as many people use restored pronunciation today. Prior to this, even though Latin was written with the late Republican orthography, it was pronounced in the vernacular way, even by the educated. We English speakers comparably use Middle English style orthography that has not been fully updated for modern English phonology. Thus, 8th century Proto-Italian, Proto-Spanish, and others were, in fact, the same thing as Latin, and the word choice and grammar of formal texts was a matter of style, not diglossia, as demonstrated by Roger Wright in his book Late Latin and Early Romance. See my video over on Scorpio Martianus, where I show an attempt at the late Roman Empire pronunciation of Latin in Italy. Thence the new Carolingian Latin pronunciation, a totally artificial entity, diverged into the national pronunciations of the various European peoples, and the Italian Ecclesiastical has risen to prominence since its adoption for all Catholic rites by Pope Pius X, circa 1910. So, having confessed to a few close friends my delight in the sound of ecclesiastical Latin, I've often pondered why I should like it so much. Perhaps a scene from Braveheart might elucidate how I feel.
Sanguinarius homo indomitus est, et semper dicens mentatium.
Ego nunquam pronunciare mentatium. Sed ego sum homo indomitus.
Doesn't that sound cool?
Sanguinarius homo indomitus est, et semper dicens mentatium. Ego nunquam pronunciare mentatium, sed ego sum homo indomitus.
But why? Why do I like this? There are a few reasons, I believe. Number one, nostalgia. Like many, I grew up singing in choirs in Latin long before I learned to speak it or anything about historical phonology. I mean, just listen to Friar Alessandro. Doesn't this sound exquisite? Number two, Italian. As an Italian speaker, it is easy for me to recognize that the sound inventory in ecclesiastical Latin is, not surprisingly, very similar to that of the chief language of the famous peninsula.
Sulla richiesta che è quella del Tribunale dei Ministri di Catania nei confronti di Matteo Salvini. È una richiesta che si riferisce a luglio scorso.
And just listen to the news! Even the dry news in Italian sounds great. But these two highly sentimental reasons put aside, could there be a third, more objective or quantifiable reason?
Totus Florio!
I have in the past found myself firmly in the camp of those who rather disdain the Italian ecclesiastical pronunciation as inferior, or even worse, as non-historical, an entity which has no place in the revival of an ancient tongue. Latin speakers using the Italian ecclesiastical pronunciation have probably all felt a little bit attacked at one point or another, if merely passive-aggressively, by the ever-growing international community of restored classical-using Latin speakers, who may have privately or even openly looked down on their manner of speaking. I know this because I used to feel the same way about them. And while such people who would actually openly criticize the accent are certainly few, tu mala pronuncias Latine, this has only served to alienate potential Latin speakers who don't want to try restored classical. vero, barbarus mihi videris. And sometimes a person on either side may live in complete ignorance of the other. On several of my videos on Scorpio Martianus, I have received comments from Italian ecclesiastical users who say I'm pronouncing whatever word or phoneme wrong. And for my few recitations in ecclesiastical, there are stern comments saying that restored classical is the only good or correct version of Latin pronunciation. More and more, both of these entrenched camps have started to look pretty silly to me. For the practical reason of exhorting more potential friends and allies to the cause of speaking Latin as a living language, especially those in Italy, I have found it useful not only to tolerate the accent, but even to attempt speaking in it myself with Italians and others who enjoy it. The results have been striking. After extending the olive branch, as it were, to the ecclesiastical speakers, I frequently have been shocked to then hear many members of that community spontaneously try to use classical phonetics when speaking with me. Wow! When I ask them why they would even want to do so, they respond that they would like to explore the sound of Cicero, just as restored classical folks do. Merely for the purposes of expanding our community, since perhaps the most important thing for us Guidites, for us Latin speakers, is to promote the active use of our chosen tongue, I would encourage everyone to gain competency one day at reciting or speaking fluidly in both pronunciations. After all, the sound of language is much more than the technical or historical. It's the artful, the aesthetic, the beautiful. Familiar, lovely things can generate harmony. And given the sometimes torrid rapids that may divide us, why not build bridges between our shores?
En français, si vous préférez.
Haha, see that little smile? The princess smiles because she's hearing her own language. She's hearing the sound that's most familiar. There is value in this, particularly around this time of year when Christmas carols in Latin are often sung and heard. A restored classical user, such as myself, may feel an internal conflict.
I'm being torn apart.
Wanting to go back to blissful ignorance about the existence of any historical phonology, and just enjoy the nostalgia and sing along. So, beyond nostalgia and familiarity, what could be the quantifiable third reason for liking the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin? Alright, so I made a little chart here with the principal phonemic differences between the restored classical and Italian ecclesiastical pronunciations. Starting with consonants, we have the H sound, as in hortus, with the restored classical, and here in Italian ecclesiastical, ortus, that is, the H becomes silent. The transcriptions here, these phonetic transcriptions, are in the International Phonetic Alphabet, and they are broad transcriptions. I'm not necessarily going for super precise here, since that's not particularly necessary. In this word, it's also worthy of note that we have an S, and the S sound in languages which lack a sh usually is somewhat retracted or apical, as in modern Greek, Finnish, European Spanish, and others. So the sound not s, but sh is more likely, which I've demonstrated here with the line underneath the S. That is the retracted S. So not hortus, but hortus, or something like it, I believe, is more likely for the restored classical. It doesn't matter that much. It's just a tiny little detail, and I think it's a fun little, shall we say, authentic detail to add to restored classical pronunciation. Now, Italian simply doesn't have the sound in most forms of Italian, and therefore we don't expect it to be an Italian ecclesiastical either. Moving on, the next word we have, for the QU, we have quanta. Now, the difference here between the restored classical quanta and the ecclesiastical quanta is a very subtle distinction, which is, I think, important in the restoration of the classical pronunciation, because the QU does not represent the sequence KW, as we see on the right here. It's actually the labiovelar. So we have the K, but the W is made simultaneously. The way I do this is to round my lips before I begin making the K. So I round my lips into an U form, and then I go quanta, quanta. Because if I say quanta, 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 which is how we say quest in English, quest in English, or questo in Italian, it's a sequence of KW. It's not a simultaneous thing. And this is an interesting sound. It doesn't occur in any other modern European language, and the Italian is with the qua is close, but it's not the same thing exactly. Interesting detail. So on the right, by the way, we see the net phoneme change from classical to ecclesiastical, and the net phoneme change for this is just a one-for-one replacement, and it's also a very subtle distinction. Above that, we see that a -1, that we lost the H sound in the word hortus or ortus. Next, the NGU. So the gua pronunciation is also a labiovelar. So the word for tongue or language, for example, which is lingua, lingua, lingua. Once we get to that N, we round the lips and then we form the G. At least that's how I do it. Lingua, lingua. As opposed to lingua, lingua, which is more Italian or ecclesiastical pronunciation. Lingua being, of course, an Italian word, lingua. And again, something we don't have in English. An interesting subtle distinction, it's a one-for-one transfer. The reason this is important is because we see the words, for example, in Romanian and Sardinian, for lingua is limba, with a ba. How would you get a ba? You only get it if you have a truly simultaneous labial component with this particular phoneme. So that's why this is relevant. This is why it has some importance. But, it's a tiny distinction, and I understand people who might not want to bother, but I like to try. So lingua, and also the word aqua in, say, Romanian, and I believe also Sardinian is apa. So we see how that works, that labial component. Okay, moving on. Now we get to the real meat, I believe. The real most obvious distinction of all would be the CE and CI sounds. Classical, concito, and then in ecclesiastical, concito. I've also changed the vowel qualities from all to o for the Italian type. Quite a lot of that is in free variation. I think either classically and ecclesiastically, I'm not hung up on that distinction being particularly important, but I've demonstrated. Also, I keep here the long vowels because there's absolutely no justifiable reason that ecclesiastical should be divorced from the phonemic vowel length when it's a fundamental part of Latin in all parts of its history. No matter how much it's been ignored, it still plays a part in spelling, in accentuation, and so forth. So I take for granted that it is a part of both pronunciations. So there we've added now to Latin, we see on the right a phoneme. We have a +1, ch. Ch doesn't exist in classical Latin. Going to the next one, we have the ge, the GE and GI sounds. So then for gurges, in ecclesiastical, gurges. So we've added the sound j. Next with GN, so word for large, magna or magna. I think those sounds are probably in free variation through much of the Republic and early Empire as well. Whichever one was dominant, I don't particularly care. I usually do magna, but I think magna is legitimate as well, certainly for very clear enunciation. And what does the Italian pronunciation do? It has magna. Magna. And note, very importantly, the gemination of consonants is consistently important in all pronunciations of Latin. Even if you would choose to ignore phonemic vowel length, we can't say magna. Magna. It has to be long. We see the two dots after the funny-looking N here on the second transcription. Magna. It needs to be long, and that's true of Italian as well. So we have a one-for-one replacement of na being replaced by nya. So we don't have anything added here. Next, we have the SCE or SCI sounds. So the next word for don't you know, which in classical is neskizne, neskizne. And in ecclesiastical, neshizne, neshizne. So what have we done? We've added the sh. And notice that because the origin of the sound of the SC is in fact two consonants, it's geminated. You wouldn't hear this in the beginning of a sentence, but it's geminated intervocalically. That is, if it were in between words or in the middle of a word, such as this one, neshizne, neshizne. Now this is true again also of the Italian language as it was for the GN. Okay, next letter, the S. This is a very minor point. As I mentioned previously, the S of classical Latin, as it is in modern Greek and ancient Greek, is almost certainly retracted, which is symbolized by this underlining of the S in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So rather than nisi, s, which would be, say, the sound we have in most English, s, it's retracted. The tongue is slightly higher, and the articulation point is a bit different. So instead of being nisi, 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 I'm not doing that perfectly, but nisi, is the sound we'd expect for the classical pronunciation. And what would the Italian pronunciation of Latin do? Well, it depends on the Italian. If you're north of Rome, you would probably say nisi. If you're south of Rome, you would probably say nisi. You would keep it unvoiced, even in ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation. So that's sort of a minor detail. Many people cite that as part of it, but not all Italians will agree on that. So, but I mentioned it anyway. In any case, whether it's a retracted s to a more normal s, if that's the change, or it's from a s to a z, it doesn't really matter. In any case, moving on. Okay, another really important, or I think noticeable difference, striking difference between ecclesiastical and classical pronunciations is in the ti plus vowel. This symbol here, the capital V, is for a vowel, so ti plus a vowel. So, for example, the word for change, mutatio, 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 with the long vowels and everything. So what would be the Italian version, the ecclesiastical version? Mutatio, mutatio, mutatio. So here we've added a new phoneme. The TS sound is its own phoneme, which is a kind of affricate. And then we should talk about what an affricate is. So an affricate is where we combine an occlusive, a stop, plus a fricative. So t plus s. So we get the t and then the s. Tss, tss. Just as above, when we were looking at the j and the ch, j, we have it's a dental, and then plus the palatal j, the j. And then for the ch sound as well, the dental th plus sh, 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 ch. So those are affricates, which is a combination of an occlusive plus a fricative. And if I've gotten that terminology wrong, please add in the comments below, but that's my understanding. Next, ph. So the ph in ancient Greek is simply aspirated version of the plosive or the occlusive or the stop pa. So instead of pa, 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 which is how we in English and other Germanic languages, though not all of them, like not Dutch, in English we start with, say, papa or something. We have an H sound which is added to it, papa. And if we don't do that, then we say papa, and we sound like we are a native Spanish speaker saying that word. And so what does this mean for Latin speakers? So Latin doesn't natively have this as a distinct phoneme. And we see in the phonetic transcription, we can say 1st century BC Republican educated people might be saying ampora, ampora, maybe, though Cicero himself says he doesn't do that, and instead would say ampora. In my spelling of Latin, because of Cicero's very words, I no longer add the letter H when I spell pulcher, much less triumpus or others, because I don't buy that that's a realistic pronunciation. I think there's some imperial spelling confusions there. But that's just my look on it. So it's either ampora or ampora. I certainly fully accept either pronunciation, despite the spelling, with an H or not, of this Greek word. Now, the F sound, however, it's interesting. This intrudes late in the 2nd century AD, but we'll talk about that later. When does the sound change in Greek? Well, then will tend to affect the Roman pronunciation of the word at some point during the empire, whenever it's supposed to change. We'll talk about that another time. But in any case, the PH is universally given the F sound in most ecclesiastical pronunciations. So amphora, and the F being labiodental usually causes a more N-like sound instead of amphora, amphora as usual. But that doesn't really matter that much. The point here is we have a one-for-one transfer of a simple pa into a fa between ecclesiastical, or from classical to ecclesiastical. Now the other big one, the major one, the v, or the, well, it's not v yet, the w sound, the letter V, which is vivit, here, vivit, vivit. And the Italian one, which is vivit, the ecclesiastical pronunciation, vivit. Much more familiar sounding, no doubt, to Italian pronunciation speakers. So here we have a one-for-one transfer of w to v. So we lose the w for the most part, and we replace it with v. And then one that I'm particularly notorious for, which is the final M sound, classical pronunciation multum, multum. This is for some reason given as long by Allen and others, but the Romans themselves clearly state that it's a short vowel. So there's absolutely no reason it should be multum, super long. A short nasal vowel is entirely, it just seems more likely anyway, but it's not really that important. It's multum, multum. So we have multum. And here we see symbolized with the IPA, the capital V for a vowel with the nasally symbol on top of it. So we're losing one. If it's a unique phoneme, which it is, although not heard very much, right? You can really only hear it at the end of a sentence or a phrase. Multum. If I say multuile, it basically vanishes anyway. If I say multum maneo or something, then the M is fully realized again. So it's, I think, a small loss comparatively, especially compared to the, or especially along with the H. The losing of the final M, the losing of the H are rather minor phoneme losses as far as how much information they convey. Well, the H, well, we'll talk about that. Vowels. So I'm not talking very much about the 7-vowel Italian standard or the of the qualities, of course, and the 5-vowel qualities, which, of course, we have Sardinian as an excellent model, demonstrate that we have these open and, or whatever, but I don't really mind. I don't really care about any of that. So we have, at least not for the purposes of this discussion. So I do care. Obviously, I've made way too many videos about it not to care. But so the 5 vowels we have, I'm not going to worry about. In 7 Italian, I don't particularly care. Here, I just want to talk about the diphthongs. So in classical Latin, aetas, or let me make that retracted. Aetas, aetas, aetas. And then we have the ecclesiastical etas, etas. Something else that I need to mention. Italians have a particular vitium, a particular vice of speech when they have a final consonant, and a part that is not fundamentally a part of the ecclesiastical pronunciation, which they may say etas. They add a little syllable because not having a native language which ends with consonants, they cannot, if they want to produce a final consonant, they can't without a great deal of difficulty. They have to silence that inclination to make a vowel sound and then say etas, or they'll say multum. This is not a part of ecclesiastical pronunciation. It is something, it's just a vitium that they have to get over. But anyway, etas, etas is the ecclesiastical way to do that word. So we lose one. We lose I. And then oi, foedus, 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 fadus, fadus. So we lose the oi as well. So quantifiably, what has happened? Well, as far as consonants go, the net consonant change, we added 4 new ones. What 4 did we add? We added ch, j, sh, and s. And we mutated a couple notable ones like the w to v. But we lost 2 as well. We lost the h and the final the nasally sound. So that's a net gain of 2, but the vowel change, the net vowel change is -2 as far as diphthongs go. We lost 2 diphthongs. Now, what's so this is the critical part here. Losing these diphthongs, especially I, has a very important semantic consequence. So, ecclesiastical has an augmented sound inventory with respect to restored classical, particularly in the fricatives. We have the v and the sh, and the affricates, ch and j and s, which happen quite a lot in Latin. That's what gives the ecclesiastical such a distinct character, I believe, with respect to the classical. Of course, if we remove the phonemic long vowels, as too many speakers of both classical and ecclesiastical do, which I have previously demonstrated in my video called Stop Stealing My Vowels to be, in my opinion, a highly undesirable thing, as this excises more than a quarter of the semantic information of Latin at the phonemic level, then ecclesiastical loses another 5 vowel phonemes. But there's no reason either version of Latin should be without them, so I will assume their inclusion in both. Thus, the overall variety of the sounds in Italian ecclesiastical Latin is a bit greater and adds 3 palatal consonants, which before were absent. And since I speak Latin every day, often for many hours, I find I miss these sounds, which I have in my native English as well as Italian. Now, I'm certainly not among those who find the famous Caesarean, I came, I saw, I conquered, to be lacking in any virility when uttered in restored classical. Veni, vidi, vici. I think when delivered with careful attention to vowel qualities, this can sound just as good as the Italian ecclesiastical version. Veni, vidi, vici. Yet, I admit, to my ear, the affricates do a lot to spice things up.
Et semper dicens mentatium.
Ego nunquam pronunciare mentatium.
These two short sentences have a total of 4 affricates. So, there can be no doubt that the aesthetic character of Latin changes quite a bit by applying them. Perhaps fricatives are fun because they're a combination of an occlusive, also known as a plosive or a stop, where airflow is temporarily restricted completely by the organs of speech before being exploded outward again, followed by the smooth flow of a fricative. Fricative, after all, comes from fricare, which means to rub or to massage. And the latter definition I find especially appropriate for the potentially soothing quality of a fricative. Yet we have a problem. What one hand gives, the other takes away. To speak ecclesiastical, we have to give up sounds for letters and graphemes that distinguish whole suites of words from those that are very similar but distinct in classical, like final a, e, I. The classical adverb wonderfully, mire, and the nominative feminine plural adjective, wonderful things, mirai, sound exactly the same in ecclesiastical, mire. Since both endings are extremely frequent, we have introduced thousands upon thousands of homonyms, where we once had distinct minimal pairs. Silencing the H has a similar effect. If hortus sounds like ortus, I have to perform a quick feat of mental gymnastics while I'm listening to conclude whether the speaker means garden or birth. If only we could combine the two pronunciation systems somehow. We could have all the advantages of Italian ecclesiastical pronunciation without any of its disadvantages. And what's more, is there a way to prove in the murky fragments of Roman history a time when ecclesiastical pronunciation, or something like it, actually existed? Is it utterly and historical?
It could work!
And really, how important is the historical integrity of the pronunciation system of an ancient language? I take it for granted that it is important. Just as I take for granted that if I want to learn Japanese or Russian, then I want to learn the best standard pronunciation. But when we're dealing with such a broad period of history, and we want to include so much of it, why is one better? And if it's completely and historical, if it's not historical at all, is it really losing any value? A mad quest to find in the annals of history a pronunciation system like ecclesiastical Latin that we can use as if it has historical legitimacy.